Test 1, 2, Judy, 2141. Test 1, 2, 3. Chair mic Judy. Chair mic Judy. Test 1, 2, 3, 4.
Committee will come to order. Today's hearing concerns digital trade and specifically cross-border data flows. The modern economy requires data flow and to flow freely. Individuals and businesses rely on technology and the efficient and reliable movement of data across borders. The recent decision by the European Court of Justice invalidating the 15-year-old safe harbor agreement between the United States and the European Union created uncertainty that's bad for business everywhere. We hear that a new safe harbor agreement is imminent. But if an agreement is not reached by the end of January 2016, then the consequences for transatlantic data flow and business operations could be dire. To help us reach a new agreement with the EU, the House passed the Judicial Redress Act last month. Though it still awaits Senate action, it is a strong move by the House to in support of reaching this vital agreement. But cross-border data flow are not simply a transatlantic issue. They also figure prominently in the Trans-Pacific Partner Agreement, or TPP. As we consider digital trade issues more globally, it is important to view the tactics being used to restrict it as much as any other point of it. The trade barriers being used to restrict cross-border data flows are simply non-tariff trade barriers. By any other name, it is protectionism, and it hurts U.S. competitiveness. It hurts the very countries who are implementing these protectionist agreements, and ultimately, it will hurt global trading with all the partners who depend on data's free flow in a 21st century. These trade barriers include localization requirements for cloud computing. That means that instead of harnessing the economies of scale that come from a cloud, companies will be forced to house in facilities in individual countries, resulting in duplicative infrastructure and higher cost. Let us bear in mind that a location anywhere on the face of the earth is a location everywhere on the face of the earth. And many countries seem to ignore that in favor of basically an infrastructure construction project being mandated in their country. And it's not just technology companies that could be harmed by these types of digital trade barriers. In the financial services industry, banks use a security practice known as sharding that splits a single customer's information into discrete packets that are stored in multiple locations to prevent a hacker from compromising it. By its very definition, this practice would be impossible without the free flow of data. In July, we held a hearing on the Internet of Things, or IoT. This new era of technology relies on sensors transmitting data to a cloud for analysis. If the data cannot flow freely around the globe, then the Internet of Things technologies will not be as successful as they could be, and in fact could restrict many of the technologies already implemented in the Internet of Things. If countries are allowed to unduly restrict data flow, what is to stop them from creating new market access requirements that require companies to share source code, trade secrets, utilize or source solely from local companies, and more absurdly, force U.S. studios to alter their storyline of a movie as a condition of market access? The last one isn't that absurd. A report published just last week by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission explains just how China's regulators do just that as a condition of market access. As this committee works to promote digital trade, we are continuing a long battle against market access barriers that take surprisingly and oftentimes strange forms. Though the issues can oftentimes seem complex, the goal here is to actually make this simple and understandable for the American people, to ensure free and fair trade, improving U.S. competitiveness globally. Digital trade helps drive the modern economy, and I look forward to our witnesses today and a healthy debate on these issues. Last but not least, it goes without saying that no one owns data in a global environment exclusively. An economic transaction for an American who is traveling in a foreign country requires a look back to their country. If the United States refuses to provide that data, well, another country refuses to provide the information as to what is being bought or what service is being procured, then in fact you have a standoff. I won't let my data flow to you to tell you what customer X is buying, and you won't tell me if customer X can pay for it. Can you imagine trying to travel with a MasterCard or a Visa or an American Express that simply couldn't cross international lines? Sounds absurd? Not if everyone says, my data is mine and I won't share. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's global economy is largely a digital economy. Thanks to the Internet, massive amounts of data can be sent across the globe in an instant, connecting businesses and consumers alike. The ability to easily transmit data at low cost throughout the world has spurred tremendous innovation and fostered significant economic growth. But various countries have erected barriers to the free flow of data across borders. Some of these restrictions are intended to stifle dissent and free speech. Some are purely protectionist in nature, while some are for other policy reasons, such as protecting the privacy of a country's citizens. Today's hearing presents a good opportunity to examine what rules should govern the international flow of data, and what role the United States can play in establishing and enforcing these policies. When we talk about cross-border data flow, it could be something as simple as someone in the New York office of a multinational bank and emailing a colleague in the bank's Hong Kong office. It could also be someone sitting in Paris accessing their Facebook account, or logging onto iTunes and downloading movies and songs contained on American servers. But it also has much more complex applications. Cloud computing allows businesses and consumers to store data in servers that could be located anywhere in the world. And some global businesses gather data across their worldwide operations to a centralized location where it can be analyzed to better streamline their supply chain or improve service to their customers. Companies of every shape and size and across nearly every industry rely on data that crosses international borders at some point along its journey. That is why it's important that we carefully examine any restrictions that might impede the free flow of data. Some restrictions, like those that block access to social media or filter out political dissent, are clearly improper and threaten the human rights of those countries' citizens. America should continue to lead the world in opposing repressive regimes that stifle the freedom of their people. Other restrictions, like those requiring a company to process data domestically or to locate certain infrastructure in-country, are often intended to bolster domestic companies. Many of these restrictions can be removed in the context of trade agreements. But I have been a persistent critic of some such agreements, in part because of their devastating impact on American jobs, and we should tread carefully in the digital realm before we make some of the same mistakes we have made with physical goods. More complicated to address are limitations on data flow that countries impose to advance other policy goals, like privacy protection. Finding the right balance between protecting the needs of American businesses, respecting the legitimate policies of other nations, and ensure that other countries respect ours is not an easy task. That was made clear by the recent decision by the Court of Justice of the European Union to invalidate the US-EU Safe Harbor framework. This important agreement enabled more than 4,000 American businesses to transfer the personal data of EU citizens to the United States if the companies certified that they would comply with certain adequacy requirements to protect personal privacy. The Court, however, determined in part that because the Safe Harbor scheme only applies to companies and not to public authorities, there was not adequate protection for EU citizens from U.S. surveillance activities, and the entire agreement was therefore invalidated. The Court also found that EU citizens do not have sufficient remedies under U.S. law if their privacy rights after a transfer are violated. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, and the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Conyers, deserve great credit for working to address the second issue by drafting the Judicial Redress Act, which will provide important privacy protections for EU citizens under U.S. law. The Judicial Redress Act has already passed the House, and I hope the Senate will take it up shortly. I also appreciate the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is hard at work negotiating a new safe harbor agreement. I hope a new agreement is reached soon, but I also hope that Congress will view this incident as a wake-up call. The USA Freedom Act took an important step in curtailing surveillance activities, but we should go much further in strengthening our privacy protections. It should not take a European court to prod us into protecting our own citizens. To ensure that businesses have the flexibility they need, while consumers have the protections they deserve, the United States must work with its partners in the global community to set clear standards governing cross-border data flow. I look forward to discussing what these standards ought to be with our esteemed panel of witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Goodlatte, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing reflects a new twist on the same old song. U.S. companies are at the forefront of the digital economy, and as our companies look to operate globally, they face new and novel non-tariff trade barriers that could make it costly or near impossible to operate overseas. As we work to promote digital trade, we must work to make sure that the international playing field is fair. When foreign countries attempt to raise trade barriers or put in costly regulations as a cost of doing business, we need to call it out for what it is, a barrier to free and fair trade. We are now in a world where, on one side of the globe, the United States has negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement with rules promoting cross-border data flows and preventing undue restrictions, such as localization requirements. And on the other side of the globe, we look at Europe, which has invalidated a 15-year-old safe harbor agreement. This decision translates into uncertainty for thousands of American companies doing business in Europe, which could have a ripple effect on our economy. As the United States and Europe continue to negotiate the new safe harbor agreement, we must understand that this is a complex issue for all sides. And we are cautiously optimistic that the administration and our European allies will be able to come to an agreement that eliminates uncertainty and allows transatlantic commerce to continue. In the House, we recently passed the Judicial Redress Act. This bipartisan bill, awaiting Senate action, extends certain privacy protections to citizens of European countries, as well as other allied nations, if the federal government willfully discloses information in violation of the Privacy Act. Under this bill, citizens of designated countries would be extended the core benefits of the Privacy Act, which already applies to Americans with regard to information shared with U.S. law enforcement authorities, including the ability to bring a lawsuit for the intentional or willful disclosure of personal information. This hearing is important because the rules of the road that are considered on digital trade and data flows will either promote or impede the growth of the Internet. A recent BSA report stated that 90% of all of the world's data was created in just the last 2 years. While an incredible statistic, it also shows how important data and data flows are to innovation and economic growth. Localization requirements, such as forcing companies to locate data centers in a particular country, defeat the whole point of cloud computing. New technologies like the Internet of Things and cloud computing rely on cross-border data flows. Undue restrictions could prevent companies like Boeing and GE from using IoT sensors in jet engines to send back real-time data to their engineers in the United States. For global diversified technology and manufacturing companies, they would face the absurd situation of not being able to move their own R&D data from country to country. Restrictions on data flows fail to recognize the importance of interconnected global supply chains and the need for the uninterrupted movement of data. As this committee continues to study this issue, it is important for us to keep in mind the effects on public policy today and in the future. I am hopeful that the right policies will help fuel the engine of American innovation, prosperity, and creativity. I think we have a great panel assembled today, and I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. We now will hear from the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman Issa. I think this is a more important hearing than a lot of people appreciate it. Certainly that's the case with myself. And to our distinguished list of panelists. We welcome you all, particularly Dr. Atkinson. But I just want to get something out about the digital trade, because the growth of our economy relies on the expansion of the global digital economy and efficient cross-border data flow as digital trade becomes a larger portion of the global economy. That's the heart of my introductory comments. According to the United States International Trade Commission, a digital trade increased U.S. average wages and helped create about 2.4 million full-time positions in 2011. The same year, digital trade also increased annual U.S. GDP by 4.8%. As we hear from today's witnesses, which I welcome, I'd like to have considered the following points. To begin with, any discussion on digital trade and unrestricted cross-border data flows requires a serious discussion on surveillance reform. Surveillance reform. Earlier this year, a coalition of companies, trade associations, civil rights organizations wrote to the leadership of both parties to outline the economic costs of a significant erosion of global public trust in both the United States government and the United States technology sector. Their fears appeared to have been prescient. Last month, citing concerns about insufficient privacy safeguards in the U.S. Court of Justice of the European Union suspended the U.S.-EU Safe Harbor framework that allows about 4,400 United States-based companies to move digital information across the Atlantic. The decision is a reminder that we need to have a thorough conversation about surveillance reform. Without one, we cannot fully address eliminating restrictions on cross-border data flow. A couple weeks ago, the House took a step toward a fuller discussion by passing H.R. 1428, the Judicial Redress Act, which our colleague Jim Sensenbrenner introduced, and I was proud to be a co-sponsor of. The bill extends to the citizens of certain foreign countries privacy protections, and it will facilitate information sharing partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the globe. This will save lives. Although there is far more work to be done, I hope that our allies will take our work on the Judicial Redress Act as a sign of good faith and a first step. We must continue to work to restore the public trust necessary for the continued success of the United States industry overseas while protecting individual rights. Digital trade and cross-border data flows are transforming how American consumers and small businesses operate and interact. For example, Ford Motor Company and Boeing analyze in real time digital data from their vehicles and aircraft. This helps them diagnose problems and quickly find solutions.
Okay.
This saves consumers money and saves lives. Similarly, small businesses depend on having efficient cross-border data flow in digital trade. For example, digital trade affords them the ability to expand into foreign markets. Consumers rely on online payment processors like PayPal to process their payments globally from purchases on online platforms and small businesses. Finally, the flow of data across international borders presents a unique regulatory setting. Congress, the administration, foreign governments, and non-governmental actors must provide solid consumer protections that safeguard the development of these ever-increasing data flows. The smart and thoughtful discussion I believe we ought have today will be to illuminate barriers to future growth that we need to consider and address. According to studies, restrictions like data localization mandates hinder economic development in those countries that erect barriers to digital trade. We should examine how they affect consumers and United States-based businesses. Still, some barriers are necessary to protect against the digital trade of illegal goods and services, such as digital piracy and the trafficking of child pornography. I look forward with interest to the witnesses here at today's hearings, and I thank the chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all... For what purpose the gentleman seek recognition?
Committee on Courts and Intellectual Property and the Internet hearing dated November 2, 2015.
Without objection, placed in the record.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Without objection, other members' opening statements will be made as part of the record. We now move to our distinguished panel for today. The witnesses' written statements will be entered into the record in the entirety, and I'd ask you to please summarize within 5 minutes or less your opening statement. To help us stay within the timing, as you may be used to, you will see a red, yellow, and green light in front of you. Please think of them like you do the lights that you never run in your daily driving habits. Before I introduce the witnesses, I would ask that all witnesses please rise to take the oath pursuant to the committee rules. Raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Our witnesses today include Ambassador Peter Algier, President of the Coalition of Service Industries, Dr. Robert Atkinson, President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Ms. Victoria Espinel, President and CEO of BSA, the Business Software Alliance, or the Software Alliance now as we want to call it, and Mr. Ed Black, President and CEO of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and certainly never least, Mr. Mark McCarthy, Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the Software and Information Industries Association. And with that, we'll go down, starting with the Ambassador. Oh, and before you begin, I would note that we're going to go about 5 or 10 minutes into when the bells ring, and then we'll be gone for roughly half an hour. But we'll try to get through as many witnesses as possible. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to participate in today's hearing. The global economy today is in the midst of two revolutions that are inextricably linked: the digital revolution and the services revolution. And the United States is in the best position to define the courses of these revolutions and to benefit from them if we follow appropriate policies, especially in international trade. Now, the services revolution is evident from the fact that service is by far the largest source of jobs, of GDP, and of job growth. And more importantly, they are the enablers of all other sectors of the economy, including manufacturing, agriculture, and energy. At the center of the services revolution, however, is the second revolution, the digital revolution. And all services, indeed all parts of the economy, depend upon digital communication within their own businesses, with their customers, and with their suppliers. And the Internet, of course, is emblematic of the digital revolution. This revolution has enabled services to be delivered digitally across borders to a degree that was unimaginable 2 decades ago. But the international rules and provisions governing trade in services and digital trade have not kept up with these developments. So they urgently need to be updated and brought into line with the realities of a digitally connected world. Now, as a number of the members already have said, many countries that do not share our entrepreneurial and technological aptitudes seek to get advantage by imposing legal restrictions on the ability of a firm to manage and move its own data across borders, or they impose requirements to store data on local servers. A common measure by such countries is for the government to require that foreign firms establish facilities for storing and processing their data in the jurisdiction that they are serving. This tendency is particularly pronounced in regulated sectors such as banking, insurance, and telecommunications. These localization requirements essentially make cloud computing services impossible. Examples of local data storage and processing requirements abound. Just for example, in Greece, in China, in India, in Russia, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia. So it is essential that our government oppose attempts in all sectors to impose localization requirements on local businesses. The opportunity to do so lies in the various trade negotiations that are occurring now. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the Trade and Services Agreement in Geneva, and also work in the World Trade Organization. These negotiations should set the standards for digital trade by, 1, ensuring parties can transfer, access, process, and store data across borders. 2, prohibiting parties from requiring the establishment or use of local servers. 3, ensuring non-discriminatory treatment of digital products and services from other parties. And 4, allowing parties to regulate cross-border data flows for legitimate policy reasons, but only within the accepted standards that are included in the World Trade Organization in the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. So how are we doing with respect to using these trade agreements? The TPP has made important progress in advancing the objective of freedom for cross-border data flows and prohibitions on localization requirements. However, it includes one very disturbing exception to the prohibition on localization requirements, and that is that financial services, including banking and insurance, are excluded from the localization prohibition. Every other business has that prohibition in this agreement. But most disturbing is that this exception was at the insistence of the U.S. government, and this misguided position gives our trading partners the perfect political argument to impose such requirements on our businesses. What we need to do, in addition to fixing that, is to ensure that we don't repeat that mistake in the negotiations that are taking place elsewhere, in the transatlantic negotiations and in the Trade and Services Agreement. I'll just make one point about safe harbor, because that also is something that is extremely important. Everybody knows that that decision was just handed down by the Court of Justice in Europe. Our member companies are very eager to work with the Congress and the administration to find a solution that preserves our companies' ability to move data across the Atlantic, but with appropriate respect for individuals' privacy. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. We very much appreciate the opportunity to be part of this today and congratulate you on the attention that you are paying to this issue. It's extremely important to the services industry, but also to the economy more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Atkinson.
Good afternoon, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Nadler, and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this critical issue. In my written testimony, I go into great length and detail on all the economic benefits to both the global and the U.S. economy from cross-border data flows. So I won't go into that too much, but I want to make one point that a couple of others have made, which is this is not, quote, just a Silicon Valley thing. Cross-border data flows are critical to a wide variety of industries: mining, agriculture, automobile production, finance, retailers. So this is really something that's affecting all of our industries, all sizes of companies. And unfortunately, we don't have the ability to control our own fate here because a growing number of nations are engaging in digital protectionism. Some of the policy reasons for them are perhaps legitimate in the sense that they have this concern for privacy. In other cases, privacy is a guise for just naked protectionism. They don't want data to flow outside their country in order to benefit their own domestic companies. And in still other cases, companies are requiring data to reside in their borders so that they can have unfettered government access to that data without the rule of law. But whatever the rationale, this data protectionism hurts the U.S. economy. It raises costs for our companies. It makes them have less global market share. That's why in 2013, ITIF estimated that the cost to U.S. technology companies alone from all of the Snowden revelations and the backlash against us and the restrictions that countries were putting in place under the guise of the Snowden revelations, our technology companies stood to lose anywhere between $21 and $35 billion by next year in revenues, in global revenues. That hurts not just our technology companies, but the U.S. economy and U.S. workers. So what do we need to do? I think one of the things we cannot do for a lot of, I think, reasons, but one is we cannot simply say that the way to solve this problem is to adopt the most stringent privacy regime in the world. We can't have another region, another country tell us what our laws and rules should be with regard to privacy. Our view is our privacy rules and policies are actually the reason we lead in the global digital economy, not the other way around. So we cannot have one solution. Now the good news is we don't have to have one solution. The way we've argued very, very strongly that when a U.S. company operates on foreign soil, they're subject to the laws of that country. They can't, just by moving data back to the U.S., they can't get out of their legal obligation. They can't then say, well, we're going to use U.S. privacy policies even though we have a branch in Brussels. So in a lot of ways, I think this is a lot of much ado about nothing. We can look just, for example, at the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, who has filed a number of successful suits against U.S. companies who have branch plants or facilities in Canada, who have broken or purportedly broken Canadian privacy law by moving the data back to the U.S., processing it in a way that was against Canadian rules. The Canadian government had the ability and the right to bring action against those U.S. companies. They did so, and they prevailed. There's no reason why Europe couldn't do the exact same thing. So what do we need to do? I agree with the ambassador. We really need to push forward on two steps. So the first step being trade agreements. TPP reportedly has strong agreements, protections for digital trade there, TISA as well. But I think the key challenge there is really making sure that any national security or privacy exceptions are very, very narrow. The risk is that the exceptions won't be narrow and countries will use this again as a guise to restrict data flows. I also think the U.S. should not be overly defensive, at least on the commercial side of the ledger. We have a right to do what we're doing. Our companies aren't really breaking any laws, by and large. And I think it's time for us to at least put on the table the possibility of a WTO suit against Europe. Europe has, as we all know, cut off our access to data flows to the U.S. because of the safe harbor. They have not cut off data flows to Israel. They have not cut off data flows to Argentina. Both of those countries still have agreements with Europe, and yet there is no evidence that the national security protections for government access to that data in Israel or Argentina are any less stringent than ours. If Europe wants to go down this path, they should cut off data flows from every country in the world, not just the United States. And lastly, the one area we do need to act on is with regard to government access of data. Our companies in America can comply with foreign laws quite well, and when they don't, they can be prosecuted. What they can't comply with is what government does with data. That's why we've proposed that we work with Europe to craft what we call the Geneva Convention on data, where we come up with a set of norms and rules that we would all agree with in terms of government access to data to restore that trust. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today.
And thank you, Ms. Espedro. Sorry, Ms. Espinel, I do that. I apologize. Thanks, Victoria. Try, Victoria, pull it a little closer, see if that works.
Maybe mine's off. Can I borrow yours? Thank you.
His was very effective.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Espinel, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of BSA, the Software Alliance. Promoting international trade by eliminating barriers to cross-border data flows is a top priority for us and for our members, and today's hearing presents a tremendous opportunity to explore 3 areas. First, the growing importance of data and digital trade. Second, forward-looking efforts to expand such trade through agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and troubling recent developments in Europe and other markets that could derail these potential opportunities. International trade is critical to our members, and, as is the case for many other sectors, international trade for our members increasingly involves data services and digital rather than physical transactions. The economic implications of this software-enabled data revolution are enormous. Economists predict that making better use of data could lead to a data dividend of $1.6 trillion in the next 4 years, and that efficiency gains alone could add almost $15 trillion to the global GDP by 2030. That's an amount that is equal to the current economy of the United States. But beyond the economic implications, data is central to the lives of billions of people around the world. Farmers use data to reduce pesticide and water use while increasing yields. Families are cutting down on their commute times. Cities are redesigning transportation routes that save time and reduce pollution. Doctors are using data to save the lives of premature babies and do research on Alzheimer's. People around the world are using data to improve their lives. Because the actual processing and analysis of data often takes place in various locations that are miles or even continents apart, it is critically important to be able to move data freely across national borders. And as excited as BSA members are about the potential for software and data-driven innovation to spur growth, we are deeply concerned about steps that several U.S. trading partners have considered or taken to erect barriers to digital trade and cross-border data flows, including Brazil, Nigeria, China, Russia, and many others. These barriers take many forms. Sometimes they expressly require that data stay in country, or they impose unreasonable conditions in order to send it abroad. In other cases, they require the use of domestic data centers or other equipment. In light of the troubling growth and barriers to data flows, BSA members welcome the recently concluded TPP. We understand, based on briefings and discussions with U.S. and TPP partners, that the agreement includes several commitments that are vital to digital trade. First, robust commitments on cross-border data flows, including explicit prohibitions on data and server localization mandates. Second, a prohibition against imposing custom duties on digital products. And third, prohibitions against requiring companies to disclose software source code as a condition of competing in the market. This is the first time that strong, enforceable rules on data have been included in an FTA agreement, and it is a historic opportunity. We look forward to studying carefully the final text and to working with the administration and members of Congress as the agreement moves forward. While we are pleased by the important rules that the TPP will provide with many of our trans-Pacific trading partners, we are concerned by potential new obstacles that have recently arisen with our biggest transatlantic trading partner, the European Union. As the subcommittee is aware, the European Court of Justice recently handed down a decision that invalidates the safe harbor, a mechanism that nearly 5,000 U.S. companies of all sizes have relied on for more than a decade to facilitate digital commerce with customers, suppliers, and partners in Europe. The invalidation of the safe harbor has broad ramifications for transatlantic trade, not only for software, but for many other sectors of the economy as well. The current situation has led to uncertainty for European and American individuals and the businesses that serve their needs and the millions of customers that are served by them. We encourage Congress and the U.S. government to respond with urgency and focus, and we thank each and every member of this committee for their vote on the Judicial Redress Act, and we hope that the Senate follows your lead. Our members work hard to build privacy and security into their products and services and are committed to protecting the data in their care, regardless of where that data originates. We are ready to work with Congress and the U.S. government and with the EU and its member states to ensure that data continues to move across our borders to the benefit of both Americans and Europeans. Thank you again for providing this opportunity to share our views on these important matters, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Black. I'm afraid now you're not quite loud enough.
Thank you for your focus on this important issue. CCI members and our industry are directly impacted by barriers to international data flow, as are many other industry sectors that utilize our services. CCI members alone generate revenues in excess of $540 billion and employ over 750,000 workers. International data flows are critical to U.S. economic interests. While the top Internet brands are American-based, the majority of their users are abroad. Increasingly, our most important exports are access to platforms and provision of services. Internet platforms uniquely empower businesses to participate in the global economy. Small businesses in the U.S. would be the biggest winners if we can eliminate digital trade barriers. This is not a zero-sum game, but a win-win one. Global citizens and economies will also benefit if other governments eliminate digital trade barriers, which effectively lock their own citizens out of the 21st century economy. U.S. policies have not adequately adapted to the new reality. We excel at the export of bits, but under current trade rules, countries can far more easily block bits than bananas. While TPP begins to make progress on digital trade, the situation worsens faster than U.S. policy can respond. We must do more. We should bring trade cases against countries who block bits. Unless the trade system meaningfully responds to Internet trade barriers, our industries have little to gain from the trade agenda. 5 issues must be prioritized: Internet blocking, forced localization, intermediary liability, balanced copyright, and data protection. TPP should make progress on blocking and forced localization, but the problem is worsening. A third of the world's 3 billion-plus Internet users live where social media or messaging apps have been blocked, and the adoption of forced localization policies abroad keeps accelerating. Sensible intermediary liability rules are essential. Internet businesses have thrived here because of carefully crafted legal safe harbors, but foreign liability rules frequently favor domestic plaintiffs. Foreign courts often shoot the messenger when users express unfavorable views online about government, royalty, or national heroes. This has to change. Particularly troubling is the so-called EU right to be forgotten. European data regulators are prohibiting online services from simply linking to published news accounts about individuals. Some have even prohibited linking to stories that reported on these cases and have even demanded the removal of such links worldwide. If foreign officials punish U.S. companies for appointing U.S. citizens to lawfully publish news articles, we must stand up for free trade and free speech. Another barrier for our digital exports is unbalanced copyright. We have failed to export strong copyright limitations along with strong protections. Thus, we're seeing demands for snippet taxes to be paid for the privilege of quoting news. Such taxes on U.S. services subsidize foreign news publishers and violate international law. Since U.S. policy hasn't made them a priority, we're seeing such laws metastasize in Spain, Germany, and elsewhere. Finally, data protection barriers are a problem. Recently, the EU Court of Justice, as my colleagues have mentioned, struck down the safe harbor framework. It has been used by thousands of U.S. companies to lawfully transfer data between Europe and the U.S. This decision forces thousands of businesses to find alternative tools to ensure they can lawfully transfer data from the EU. Current alternatives are costly, piecemeal, and difficult to implement for all companies, especially smaller ones. It is essential that a safe harbor framework be implemented promptly. For the Internet to flourish as a tool for innovation, expression, and commerce, we must commit to showing that users worldwide continue to have confidence in the services of U.S. Internet companies. Passage of the U.S. Freedom Act was a step in the right direction, as will be the hoped-for passage of the Judicial Redress Act. Our domestic policies must also reinforce our own commitment to this free flow of data. For example, since cross-border access to competitive telecommunications is essential to facilitating the free flow of data, eliminating bottlenecks in U.S. telecom networks via proceedings such as FCC's current Special Access Reform Review will enhance our global credibility. In conclusion, our economy's future is intertwined with the Internet, but threats to Internet commerce proliferate. We must prioritize protecting this vital part of U.S. commerce. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Nadler.
Once again, we'd like to hear you better.
Is that better?
Pull it a little closer and let's see.
Is that better? No.
Sequestration
There we go.
hits us all.
On behalf of a Technology Trade Association, thank you for your equipment. I want to make 3 points in my testimony. First, cross-border data flows fuel 21st century trade and investment across all sectors of the economy, not just technology or internet companies. Second, one goal of U.S. policy is to reduce barriers to trade, to digital flows around the world, and we should stay the course on this wise policy. And third, the recent European decision on the safe harbor is a step backwards for open data flows. A new workable safe harbor must be put in place as soon as possible. Mr. Chairman, digital trade involves tech products like software, where exports are growing at about 9% a year. But digital trade also involves business services generally, financial sector, royalties and licensing revenue, and communication services. It is 60% of all trade in services, and it's growing 3 times faster than other service exports. Digital trade increases our economic output by up to $711 billion a year. As Mr. Conyers mentioned, that's 4.8% of our gross domestic product, and it increases employment by 2.4 million workers. We have a global surplus in digital trade of $150 billion. A loss of open data flows would not be a minor sector-specific irritant. Data localization mandates have been studied for other economies. They would impose large welfare losses, up to $63 billion for China and $193 billion for the European Union. Mr. Chairman, one goal of U.S. trade policy is to promote cross-border data flows. Congress has instructed U.S. trade negotiators to dismantle measures that impede digital trade in goods and services, that restrict cross-border data flows, or require local storage or processing of data. Any exceptions have to be narrow, the least restrictive on trade, and non-discriminatory. The United States has largely achieved these goals in the TPP agreement, although I concur with Ambassador Algire's remarks on financial services. That's an unfortunate exception. But we must seek similar outcomes in TTIP and TISA. Mr. Chairman, the demise of the safe harbor is a setback for open data flows. It's been in place since 2000, and the invalidation just this month left 4,400 companies in legal limbo. And that's not just technology companies. The list of safe harbor companies includes many SIIA members, companies in online publishing and information services. In fact, the list of safe harbor companies reads like a who's who of American brand name corporations, including Ford Motor Company, Starbucks, and the Walt Disney Company. We need a new safe harbor. We need a safe harbor 2.0. Congress can help. Your passage of the Judicial Redress Act was a step forward. It's a modest step, but one that we need to follow in the Senate. We're hopeful that the Senate will act quickly on this bill and move forward with it. Mr. Chairman, we urge this committee to stay the course on promoting data flows and to help establish a new safe harbor for transatlantic data sharing. I stand ready to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Nadler has responsibility on the floor after this vote, so he will do the round of questioning, and then we will recess until after 3 quick votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Atkinson, in your testimony, you urge the U.S. to lead on reform of government access to data so that other nations do not have an excuse to restrict cross-border data flows. You also note that after the Edward Snowden revelations about the U.S. government's expansive and intrusive surveillance programs, a number of countries pulled data out of the U.S. and imposed restrictions on the flow of data to this country. Can you describe the impact that the Snowden revelations had on American companies, and can you expand on what sorts of reforms we should put in place if we lead on reform, as I agree we must?
Sure, thank you. For a long time, countries were wanting to do these kinds of things, but never had the sort of public excuse or rationale. And a case in point is China. China, in the last year and a half, as I document in my testimony, has put in place a number of restrictive policies that negatively affect U.S. companies. And the goal there, and the reason they say they're doing it is exactly because of the Snowden revelations. They talk about secure and controllable technology and other kinds of things. And these are just, frankly, just an outright guise on their part. This is a policy they've long wanted to do, to punish or to favor their own domestic companies at the expense of U.S. companies. We see that in Germany, for example, where you have some major German technology companies that are marketing themselves as NSA-free and pushing the European Commission to adopt policies like the, quote, European cloud, so that NSA or other law enforcement agencies in the U.S. couldn't get access to the data. And there have been a number of cases that have been documented where U.S. technology companies have actually lost market share. We see that in Australia, where one of the leading cloud providers, domestic cloud providers in Australia, has been arguing the exact same thing, in fact, funding a report trying to convince the Australian government to ban storage of data outside the country with U.S. providers. So in our view, it's been a systemic effort to target the leadership of U.S. technology companies. And what do we do about it? As I said, I think it's a two-part process. It is that we do need, there are some reforms that we need to make domestically. A number of people have talked about judicial redress, other steps that we could take. But at the same time, I would agree with a couple other panelists who said that I think we just have to get tougher on trade enforcement and negotiations with these countries, particularly China, which is getting away with murder on many, many fronts, engaged in a systemic effort to take market share away from U.S. companies.
Thank you. And as you know, FBI Director Comey and other law enforcement officials have argued that the government must maintain a backdoor into technology and have opposed strong encryption measures. Do you think that would be a mistake? And if so, why?
I do think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake for several reasons. Number one, if the technology is inexorably going in the direction of unbreakables or encryption where the key is not public, it's just between two parties. The technology provider doesn't have the key, the government doesn't have the key. That's where the technology is going. I think the FBI is fighting a losing battle there, as they fought a losing battle in the 90s with the Clipper chip. The second problem with that is if they try to mandate that, they're setting, I think, a dangerous precedent, for example, by letting the Chinese government do the exact same thing, which is the Chinese government is trying to do the same thing right now to prevent encryption in China for U.S. companies. And finally, weakening our encryption technology that U.S. companies would use might give the FBI more access, but it would also give the Chinese and the Russians and anybody else who wants to do harm to us, it would give them access as well.
Thank you. My last question to you, and I think for this series, is as you explained in your testimony, support for free trade in data does not mean we must allow the free flow of illegal content like child pornography or email spam or pirated creations and other banned products. But what if two countries have different standards of what is illegal or objectionable? You may have a country that thinks political dissent is objectionable, but pirated movies are perfectly acceptable. Even in a less extreme case, countries may treat certain content differently under the law. How should countries determine what data should be permitted to flow freely between them in cases of disagreement on these standards?
Again, as I said earlier, I think it's essentially an untenable project that we would end up with global harmony on every single rule with regard to the internet. We're not going to be able to do that. And we're certainly not going to be able to do that with free speech. There are certain countries, particularly more traditional religious countries, that find pornography objectionable. We don't with or at least we have free speech. We might find it objectionable, but we allow it. We're not going to agree on that. And for certain things like that, countries are going to do that. And I think we just have to be okay with that. Another example is in Germany, you're not allowed to download a copy of Mein Kampf. In the U.S., we can. Again, we're not going to change the German view. I don't know whether they're right or wrong. It doesn't make any difference. Where we can and should, though, take action is there are certain things that are clearly illegal. Under the WTO framework for intellectual property, for example, piracy and intellectual property theft can be prosecuted. So when countries engage in steps, for example, to block certain websites that are clear piracy sites, like, for example, a domain called the Pirate Bay, that should be quite we should be encouraging that. That's quite different than blocking, say, Facebook or something like that, or blocking some site just because you don't want competition. I think the key step, though, is we have to understand just in free trade, in goods free trade, there are certain things we don't allow trade in, like elephant ivory. We've signed a global agreement. You shouldn't trade in that. Doesn't mean we don't support free trade. I would argue we should apply the same standard to things like malware, pirated content, and the like.
I thank all of you. We'll stand in recess until 5 minutes after the last of 3 votes begin, because I will vote and I will walk. So 5 minutes after that, I will be here and we will pick up with those who are present. We stand in recess. The committee will come to order. I'll now recognize myself for my 5 minutes or longer if people dawdle getting back. Ambassador, when you talked about I believe you talked about the carve-out for banks. Can you go through one thing with me? What could possibly prompt the United States government to want to carve out banks?
Well, our understanding from having met with various agencies in the U.S. government is that the Treasury Department wants to maintain the flexibility that sometime in the future it might want to impose a localization requirement. We do not understand that because the issue is, will data be made available for prudential reasons, security, for law enforcement? And in this world, it doesn't matter where the data is, you can get it instantaneously, as you know.
Well, let me ask you a rhetorical question. Localization versus duplication. If the United States government had said that on all American persons and or all accounts, whether owned by non-U.S. persons or U.S. persons, there must be maintained a copy in the United States, thus not requiring localization, but simply the ability to get a copy related to U.S. bank accounts, wouldn't that have met all of their requirements?
Well, that certainly does add an element of additional cost to the operation, and so in that sense, they're not happy, wouldn't be happy about that.
Well, I hear you, but I want to have a dialogue for a moment, because I think part of the data question for all of us is cost. I hear you say cost, but with the possible exception of the IRS, it doesn't seem to maintain 6 weeks of backups. In the ordinary course, backups are a relatively cheap mass storage. So again, the question I have for you is, regardless of where live data is hosted, realistically, the only American interest, the only U.S. interest, was for purposes of the IRS, 7 years worth of data, right? So let me ask again, wouldn't any country, for purposes of sufficient information to allow them to make the appropriate tracking for tax purposes, either demand that it be maintained, a copy be maintained where they could reach it by a U.S. Law enforcement agency, or an agreement that would allow a long-arm relationship? So, for example, if you're going to host in Britain, Germany, somewhere, there has to be an ability for the IRS to be able to ask for and receive that. Would that be an example, as a former trade ambassador, would that be an example of these carve-outs that you think are limited but appropriate as long as you can demonstrate the need, the specific need that is being preserved?
Well, certainly it is an improvement in that sense that it's limited. But I guess that question, again, I say is, first of all, these businesses, insurance and banking, highly regulated. If they don't provide the data, they can lose their license. And
okay,
so,
you've made my case in a sense. Isn't it true that without the U.S. having imposed this, they already had other requirements, the FDIC and so on, that would have required banks and other financial institutions for various reasons to have a copy available for their observation and review, right?
well, they have to make it available. The question is, if the server is in Singapore and the IRS or the Fed or anybody else comes and says, I want this data, how long does it take them to get it from Singapore? Doesn't take them any faster.
Depends on the bandwidth of the pipe. Mr. McCarthy.
Mr. Chairman, I used to work at Visa, the payment card company, and so I'm familiar with
Visa payment card?
Yeah.
Small company?
Small company.
Oh, okay. I've heard of it.
I left there in 2008, but before that, we were familiar with the rules that the federal regulators had in place, and they actually provided for outsourcing of bank records, and they had rules and guidance for how it should be done, making sure that U.S. law followed the records. And under existing case law, they have a full authority to reach out wherever the bank records are stored and have the bank produce them.
So your position is that the United States asking for this in the trade agreement was unnecessary and counterproductive?
Unnecessary, counterproductive.
Is there anyone that disagrees with it being unnecessary and counterproductive? Okay, then we'll consider that it was unnecessary, counterproductive. I'll close because I want to get to the other folks that are now coming back with a very simple question. To the best of your knowledge, and you know, Mr. Snowden helped us have some of this knowledge, and WikiLeaks did too, for that matter. Isn't it true that, for example, Nigeria, a country that loses $500 million a month of oil, which is tangible and hard to steal, is in fact a place where if the United States wanted to get any and all records hosted there, they would be able to do so easier in Nigeria and be able to do so without the court's supervision at all, because ultimately, once something leaves the United States is under no obligation not to, the NSA, which has been mentioned here previously, can simply take what they want, assuming they have the technology. Isn't that true that the countries who demand that the data be kept in their country and out of the U.S. actually lose protection that is granted in the United States for under the Fourth and other amendments? Okay, we'll assume that I knew the answer to that one, Ms. Espinel.
I was just going to point out that there's a certain irony in a country like Nigeria, which is one of the countries that's putting in place things like
I use them
localization
because they can't even
requirements.
keep track of their own oil.
When I think the processes that we have in the United States to protect due process and civil liberty would stand up well against their system. So there's one of the countries of concern, and there is a certain irony there.
But let me do a final, and it's a rhetorical question, but isn't it true really that Nigeria hosting their Nigerian information really simply means that, like China and other countries, they have the ability to take, without due process potentially, the information of their citizens, where if it's hosted in the U.S., there would be due process? Yes, Dr. Atkinson.
I completely agree with that. There are a lot of countries that have nowhere near the due process, the rule of law that we have, and that in that sense, data stored in those countries can be quite problematic. That's why I raised my earlier point about the European Commission cutting us off in the safe harbor, but leaving in some other countries that have at least the same, if not more dubious, protections for government access to data.
Thank you, and I look forward to additional questions. And with that, I'd like to go to the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am struck by the unanimity among the 5 witnesses today, and I commend them all. Let me start with Dr. Atkinson. And keeping in mind the privacy concerns of Americans and our allies, how can the United States and its trade partners move forward to advance trade, free data trade? And I understand you have some regrets about strong encryption.
Is the question, I'm sorry, about encryption? Is that?
No, it's how to advance free trade, free data trade. That's the main idea here in this question.
Well, as I said, I think the challenge is that countries will use the guise of privacy as an excuse for protectionism. And as I think the Chairman's question alluded to this, I think, central point, which is as long as companies have nexus in a country, if they're doing business in a country, they cannot get out from under that country's privacy and commercial security rules and laws by moving data to a third country. They still have to comply with those laws no matter where the data are located. And I think that's really the fundamental principle that we have to go by with this. So you can protect,
Sure.
you can protect the privacy of your citizens, and you don't have to require the data be located there as long as you have jurisdiction over the company doing business there.
Thank you. Mr. Algier, with regards to privacy, what's been done and what do you think still needs to be done in order to ensure the viability of cross-border data flows?
Well, there is a structure in place already in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the agreement there on trade and services. And what it says explicitly is that governments may put in various restrictions on data to achieve certain ends. And one of them is specifically is to protect the privacy of individuals in the processing and dissemination of personal data. And so all of the countries are obliged to recognize that. And so if a country does put in place certain privacy rules, that's legitimate.
Absolutely. Now, we've passed the Judicial Redress Act. We're hoping that the other body will act with appropriate swiftness. But I think we may have something else to think about, Mr. McCarthy. Can you elaborate on how the Judicial Redress Act affects the companies that you represent?
Thank you for that question. The Act doesn't directly affect our companies. What it does do is to create a reason for the European negotiators in Safe Harbor to move ahead with finalizing the agreement. And when the agreement is finalized, then it would create enormous benefits for our companies and for Europe as well. The second reason is that there's a separate agreement called the Umbrella Agreement, which is a law enforcement agreement, where the Judicial Redress Act is actually an intrinsic part of that agreement and has to be finalized before the agreement is itself going into effect. If I might, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask unanimous consent, there's an op-ed that I published in today's Hill on this very issue. If I could ask unanimous consent that it be included in the record of the committee hearing.
As soon as I see it.
Okay.
Ms. Espinal, how does the recent invalidation of the U.S.-European Safe Harbor Agreement impact the software industry?
Thank you. So we are very concerned about the revocation of the safe harbor, and it has implications not just for software, but across our economic sectors. The cross-border data is used by nearly 5,000 companies, some of them large, many of them quite small, that use it to do all sorts of things, including process payroll so that their employees get paid at home. So we have significant concerns about the European Court of Justice decision that undermine the process put in place by the safe harbor. That said, we do think there's a path forward, and we think there are three things that need to happen. The first is that we need, as quickly as possible, to have the U.S. and the European negotiators come to agreement on a new safe harbor. The second thing is we need to have some reasonable, appropriate period of time for companies to be able to come into compliance with the new rules under that safe harbor. But third, because we know this will continue to evolve and change, we need to work together, the United States and Europe, industry and Congress, on coming up with a global, sustainable, long-term solution. It's clear that we need a new global framework for data and how it moves, and that needs to be an important part of the process as well. I would just say, lastly, going to the point that Mr. McCarthy made, passage of the Judicial Redress Act by the House is tremendously helpful, and so we thank all of you for your vote on that, and we hope the Senate follows your lead. That is, important both for our own domestic system, but is also helpful in terms of concluding negotiations on the safe harbor with Europe.
Thank you. Thanks, Chairman Arce. I yield back.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
I thank the chairman for yielding and also for holding this very, I think, important and very interesting hearing this afternoon. It's been mentioned that barriers to free trade in the digital arena have a particularly adverse impact on small businesses. And I happen to be the chairman of the House Small Business Committee, so I'd just like to give each of the witnesses an opportunity to address what steps should be taken specifically to address this adverse impact on small businesses. And I'll start with you, Mr. Allgaier, or Ambassador Allgaier, if that's okay, and I'll just go down the line. If you don't have anything to say, that's okay too. But
No, thank you very much. That's what we find, of course, is that the digital technology has opened the world to small businesses. I mean, in the past, let's say a small business wanted to go overseas. Well, you'd have to find an agent, and you'd have to have a presence overseas. Now, you put your product up on the internet, whether it's a good or a service, and it's called random exporting. You don't know whether your next customer is coming from Boise, Idaho, or Bangladesh. And then with the combination of express delivery and electronic payments, you're in the international market. And so it's extremely important that the movement of data remain open, and that people be able to have access to the internet, and particularly small businesses or people in poor areas.
thank you. Dr. Atkinson?
With the way the European Commission is negotiating the safe harbor, it's possible and hopeful that will happen, but if it doesn't, people are talking about other possible ways that companies can get access, binding corporate rules and other types of model agreements. Those are clumsy, they're expensive, they're time-consuming, but large corporations can do that. Small companies really can't, and that would be the real harm here, or the biggest harm. And so that's why I think we have to really insist that we put these very strict rules in trade agreements, so that companies don't have to do these very expensive workarounds with, particularly in Europe, where they'd have to go to 28, or if you include the German land or the states there, perhaps almost 40 different jurisdictions to be able to move data. And if you're a small company that's doing business in all of those jurisdictions in Europe, it's going to be almost impossible for you to be able to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Espinel?
So I think the risks and some of the options for small companies can be even more serious than for the large companies. So I would say a couple of things. One is specifically with respect to the safe harbor. As I said, United States and Europe need to come together on a new agreement as quickly as possible. There needs to be some appropriate period of time for companies to come into compliance, and then we need a long-term sustainable solution. But picking up on what Dr. Atkinson said, part of that is making sure that we have a good global framework for how data moves around and pushing back on restrictions of data. You know, when I think about kind of the moment that we're in with data, you know, and we live in a world where data is increasingly important, not just to big companies, but to small companies, not just to software, but to all of our sectors. It is an interesting fact that there's no comprehensive, enforceable trade rules on data. So it's kind of, you know, we're sort of at the moment that intellectual property was back in the Uruguay round when the WTO was being established. There were no global rules on intellectual property in the trading system. That was a very difficult negotiation, but it was also very far-sighted on behalf of the United States and the other trading partners to come together at the end of the Uruguay round and agree to a global framework for intellectual property rules. And I think that is exactly the moment that we are in right now with data. It is clear. It is a complicated new issue. It is also clear that it is going to be a driver of the U.S. economy and the global economy, and we need U.S. and other countries to lead on this issue and establish a global framework. I think TPP, we understand it could be, based on what we know about it, it could be the beginning of that. I think it's a real historic opportunity, but we are going to need to have those rules apply broadly across the world.
Mr. Black and Mr. McCarthy, I've only got about 30 seconds left, so you can split it up.
My colleagues have been very articulate. Let me just stress that we are in a new era, and digital trade, if we want to make a metaphor back to original trade, blocking a website, doing various kinds of barriers, or like blocking a port, and the openness of the trading system and going forward is so much tied to data and digital activity. And Ms. Espin is absolutely right. We need our laws are based on historical, outdated concept of what trade is about, and we really need to see, and that's why we call for some precedent-setting efforts in the WTO to bring some cases to start laying some criteria and ground rules for what this should be, the problem should be dealt with.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is it okay if Mr. McCarthy answers real quickly?
Without objection.
Thank you.
The one point I'd add to everything else my colleagues have mentioned is that in this global framework for data, which I think is a great idea, we have to make sure that whatever rules affect the flow of data, whether they're privacy rules or consumer protection rules or whatever, they're narrowly crafted, that they're least restrictive of trade. We can't take away the option for countries to enforce their privacy or consumer protection laws, but they can't unnecessarily trample on cross-border trade.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to my colleague, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Atkinson, you state that several countries around the world are limiting free trade in data, and you argued they are motivated by privacy and security concerns, national security and law enforcement concerns, and the desire for economic growth. The European Court of Justice recognized that the U.S. lacks an adequate level of protection for EU data, amongst other privacy concerns. Within this context, can you tell me how the EU views individual privacy and data security, and what laws or principles do they have in place, and what do we have in place here in the U.S.?
Thank you. The Europeans culturally look at privacy differently than Americans do. As a general rule, they look at privacy as a fundamental human right. We look at it as a consumer right that has to be balanced against a number of other issues. There's a lot of good scholarly evidence that shows that the European Privacy Directive and the rules that they have there actually significantly limit the internet economy in Europe. There's a reason why the Europeans don't have global leaders in the internet space by and large. The effectiveness of their companies is significantly limited because of their privacy rules. And there's a very good study by Catherine Tucker at MIT who has demonstrated that. Having said that, there's also another broad generalization that I think has some merit to it, which is that we have less stringent rules, but we do a better job through the FTC and the state AGs of enforcing them than the Europeans do. They have stronger paper rules, but less real enforcement. Having said that, I just close by saying I don't think that we're miles apart. We generally share the goal of privacy. We share the goal of the rule of law, and I do think that we can work this out in a cooperative manner as long as the Europeans are willing to be reasonable, as we need to be reasonable.
So what then do you think should be done by Congress or by the administration in these ongoing negotiations with the EU to ensure that we're providing adequate privacy protections for our citizens and for those whose data travels to our country from across the Atlantic?
So I think there's two key points there. One is I believe that we shouldn't sign a TTIP agreement with the Europeans unless it includes strict and enforceable rules around the free trade of data. I don't see why we should have that trade agreement if we don't have that component in there. At the same time, there are steps that we need to take with regard to government access of data in the U.S. that have made the Europeans rightly uncomfortable, and I do think we need to do a better job there. The Judicial Redress Act was one step in that, but I think there are other steps that we can and should take.
Can you describe which countries have the most stringent regulations when it comes to setting limitations on data flowing in and out of their country? And what effect does that have on American companies' ability to compete?
Sure. So we listed a number of countries in the written testimony, and what's troubling about that is if you look at that list, say in 2010, it would be significantly smaller. Nigeria, Turkey, Greece, Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia, Russia, China. China, just within the last year, for example, has put in place a numerous set of policies that will significantly limit the ability for American companies to process data there. So it really is something that's growing. There's a couple of Canadian provinces that do this as well. And I think one of the challenges really is they falsely believe that by doing this that they will enhance security and privacy, commercial privacy, and I just simply reject that notion. I don't believe that's the case.
Ms. Espinel, you argue that as a result of the invalidation of the EU-U.S. safe harbor, many routine commercial dealings between the U.S. and European countries have now been disrupted. Can you give us an example of this?
An example of the impact that it's having?
The disruptions that are occurring today.
So, you know, an example of an impact that could happen if data stops moving back and forth is the ability to process payroll, as an example. Warranty information that U.S. consumers rely on would be at risk. So there are a number of real-life real-life impacts. In cybersecurity, one of the maxims is that information is to follow the sun. So if you have information about a threat, you want to have that in the hands of cybersecurity experts wherever they are in the world while they are awake. And restricting the data moving back and forth to the United States and Europe could put that at risk. So I think there are a number of real-world impacts, but even at a more macro level, the promise and the efficiencies that are brought about by cloud computing and by data analytics simply do not work if information cannot move around as efficiently as possible. And I think one of the things that the trade barriers in the various countries that we see around the world and the situation in Europe is putting at risk is putting a shadow on an industry that has enormous potential but is still at a relatively early stage. And I think putting a shadow on the development of where remote computing can go and where data analytics can go at this early stage of its development is extremely troubling.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. We now go to the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Espinal, I want to go back to something, and I've got some others, but back in October last year, 2014, many of my colleagues, including myself, wrote a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative about the TPP. And just to review, first, we had several things. First, we wanted to include provisions that specifically keep borders open to free flow of data. Second, it must prohibit countries from requiring the use of local data servers and computing infrastructure as a condition for providing digital service. Third, it must ensure non-discriminatory treatment of digital products and services. Based just on the reports that have come out so far from the administration and others, where do you think we are in that right now?
So again, with the caveat that we have not seen the final text, our understanding is that the TPP has strong commitments on all of those provisions. First, on cross-border data trade, and I'm pushing back on data localization. Obviously, we would like that to be as comprehensive as possible, but our understanding is that overall, the commitments there are strong. Our understanding is that there are prohibitions on imposing custom duties on digital services, which is also important. And our understanding is that, I believe for the first time ever, there are prohibitions on forcing companies to disclose source code in order to compete in a market. Those are all very important to us. And again, based on the reports that we have heard, TPP contains strong and enforceable rules on those in those areas.
And Grant, I think we will see those, and that's part of our whole process. But if that was not there, and probably a short answer is, if these protections were not there, given the new marketplace of the future that we're looking at, that being much more in this realm, the digital realm and other in this crosspoint, would that be a serious hindrance to enactment of this agreement?
If they are, well, I hope and expect that they are there. If they were not there, I think it would be an enormous missed opportunity. We were talking earlier about the fact that this is really the future, not just of the U.S. economy, but of the global economy as a whole. There are also enormous societal benefits that come from data analytics and cloud computing. And in order for us to see the potential of those, it's enormously important that we have a global system of trading rules that gives clarity and predictability to the system.
Thanks. Mr. Atkinson, real quickly, could you please describe for the committee the problem of forced localization and how this impacts member companies and your ability to create American jobs? Mr. Atkinson.
So one of the real advantages the U.S. has is in cloud computing, for example, where we have it's in my testimony, north of 70 or 80%, maybe even more of the global market, partly because we have scale in our own domestic market that's given our companies the ability to scale up and get capabilities. Other countries look at the cloud computing industry as a core strategic industry for their countries, and one of the ways that they're trying to gain market share is by simply saying that you have to store data out, not just in country, but in some cases in country with a domestic company.
Which could present a load of problems on many different levels.
Pardon me?
Could present a load of problems on many different levels.
Even if it's just simply localization to tell an American cloud provider you have to put a server in a country, that essentially raises costs. If it was cost effective, they would have already done it by definition.
Right. Okay.
Not only does it raise costs, but something that people haven't talked about, it has environmental impacts. Cloud computing, by putting it all in one place, you can save a lot of energy, and by requiring servers all over the world. So either way, whether it's forced server localization or domestic company preferences, it's going to hurt U.S. companies and the U.S. economy.
All right. Ms. Adams, I appreciate that. Mr. Black, very forceful in this committee discussing some issues, but I've noticed something. We do read through all of your printed text before you appear. And on page 8 of your written testimony, you seem to want to have it both ways, and I think it's a concern. The first way is you basically say that U.S. Internet intermediary liability and copyright rules discourage investment and growth in domestic startups, yet 2 sentences later in the same paragraph, you say U.S. businesses have thrived domestically under carefully crafted legal framework of U.S. law. Now, you're basically contradicting yourself there. I don't know why you would do that, but I think one of the things that goes back for me is something that I've said in this committee from the day I came on. Strong copyright, strong protective laws are not a barrier, but they're a creative incentive. I believe that the framework that we have here has allowed U.S. Internet businesses to thrive, and they become a growth for your association and for many others that grow this industry. So my question is, why are we presenting what seems to be a false narrative here, on one hand saying that it discourages, and on the other hand, 2 sentences later saying it encourages?
Thank you very much for the question. Barriers to international trade data flows are a problem that we all talked about how important the economy of the future is.
Your word says domestic.
No, we look at what made our society, what in the U.S. law has worked to help build our industry. Part of it is the balanced copyright. We have a very important, well-developed, well-refined system that provides both strong copyright protection and significant limitations and exceptions. That is a key to the health and vitality of what has allowed the Internet to flourish here. We believe it is likewise, and it is appropriate for the U.S. government, as we try to persuade others in the world to have strong copyright, that they also reflect the boundaries and limitations that have proved so important to the ability of the Internet and Internet companies to flourish.
Okay, it's an interesting question. Because it's an interesting answer because it frankly didn't answer my question. Why would you contradict yourself? I understand that you want to say that, but when you said domestically, U.S. is either hindering or it's helping. You can't have it both ways in the same 4 sentences. You cannot say the U.S. Internet liability and copyright rules discourage investment and growth in domestic startups, and then 2 sentences later say U.S. Internet businesses have thrived domestically under carefully crafted legal framework in the U.S. Either the legal framework we have here is bad or the legal framework we have here is good. I believe it to be good. I'm not sure why it would be contradictory there.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
If I heard that, Mr. Black, were you saying that the international conundrums are causing problems while the domestic, well-crafted, has allowed us to thrive? Was that what your intent was in that paragraph?
That's correct.
Well, the problem is, and that would be fine if understood, except that the footnote is to a footnote to a domestic,
right,
thing, which gives you the realization that it was for that. And this is something that we've had many meetings on this from different various industries. So I think the biggest thing, the safe way to put this is, I believe that as we look at this is crafted in a well way. We continue to craft our copyright laws. It's going to help us all in this bigger picture, and not settling for what is a weaker systems in other parts of the world. And I think we can.
Again, I would just suggest weaker is the wrong terminology. A strong system is a balanced one. And just the same way, a 3-legged stool versus a 2-legged stool. The fact that you have balance and limitations in your system makes it stronger, not weaker.
Mr. Chairman,
I thank the gentleman, and without objection, Mr. Black, if you want to revise it, extend that portion to clarify it, I'm sure the committee would be happy to have that record be full and complete. And with that, we go to the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Delbene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for calling this important and timely hearing, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. First, I'm going to start with Ms. Espinel. As you state in your testimony, quote, "In striking down the safe harbor, the Court of Justice focused on issues around national security and law enforcement access to data. Troubled by the Snowden leaks, the court concluded that countries that permit indiscriminate surveillance and interception and mass and undifferentiated accessing of personal data could not be deemed adequate under EU law," end quote. While the national security piece is certainly something familiar to members of this committee, could you elaborate a bit on why the EU might be concerned about current U.S. law on law enforcement access to data?
Yes, and I think it's in part because the rules in that area, as in other areas, are unclear. So, one of the things that I think is clear is that we need a new global framework. And part of that it needs to be addressing the fact that the rules right now on how U.S. law enforcement and foreign law enforcement can access data in trading partners are unclear. You are one of the co-sponsors and introducers of the LEADS Act. We think that that approach would be a helpful part of the solution. We think it would be helpful both because it would give our businesses, but also their customers, whose data they keep, and law enforcement, a clear and predictable framework for how to access information. We additionally think it would be helpful because without that, we fear our current system in the United States will open the door for foreign governments to be able to reach back into the United States for the data of our citizens, and that is a situation that we would like to avoid.
And are there examples right now that you've seen in terms of how the lack of certainty has impacted businesses today?
Yeah, so there are a number of examples. There's a case that is actually being litigated right now in the U.S. courts between Microsoft and the Department of Justice involving data that is held in an Irish data center. The Department of Justice making a request to get that data, and Microsoft's view that the request is inappropriate under U.S. law. That is a real live example that is being litigated in the courts right now. We'll see what the outcome from the courts are, but we are concerned that if the outcome of that case is inconsistent with the position that Microsoft has taken, in which the software industry is supportive of as a whole, that will open the door to other governments being able to reach back into the United States. And so there is a domestic issue that we need to resolve, absolutely, but part of the reason that we are so concerned about that is because of the international implications of that and what that would mean for our system and the privacy of our citizens back at home.
Thank you. You know, I had a meeting with a group visiting from the EU a few weeks ago, and someone part of that group from the EU said that he felt like Americans don't care about privacy. And so are we contributing to that negative narrative about how privacy is viewed in the U.S. by failing to address some of these questions in policy ourselves?
You know, so I would say, you know, I think there are differences in approaches between the United States and Europe, but I reject the notion, actually, that the United States and Europe are that different on privacy. Yes, Europeans care deeply about privacy. Americans care deeply about privacy, too. It is enshrined in our Constitution. We have a long history of protecting privacy. I think there are improvements to our laws that have been made or in the process of being made. So I think the USA Freedom Act was a significant step forward, and I thank all of you for that. I think Judicial Redress Act is also a step forward, and hopefully, again, the Senate will pass it. I think one of the things that would be really helpful in the environment that we live in today is for there to be a constructive dialogue between the United States and Europe to truly understand our different systems. Because as I said, I don't think the differences are as far apart as people sometimes portray them. And if I could respectfully make a request of the members of this subcommittee, I think when you're in discussions with your European counterparts, I think one of the things that would be very helpful is to explain to your European counterparts how our privacy system works in the United States, some of the recent improvements that have been made in the privacy system, and try to lessen the amount of misunderstanding that I think exists today.
Thank you. I wanted to get one more quick question in for Dr. Atkinson. You spoke earlier about things that you thought we could do to bolster our credibility and standing to fight data protection, and you talked about kind of some of the other steps we could do beyond judicial redress, which we just did, and I wondered if you could be more specific and tell us about some of those other steps we could take with our own privacy laws.
Sure. I would second what Ms. Espinel just said and go to the case in the court right now with the Microsoft Irish case. And I think it's a very important case because if the principle in the U.S. is that we can access data on a foreign person without going through that country's law just because it's hosted by an American company, there will only be one result, and that will be American companies will not host foreign person data in other countries. That will be the result. The Europeans, the Irish, they will just simply say, you cannot put your data on an American cloud provider regardless of where it's located. That can't be the result we want, and that's why the LEADS Act is important. That's why, as part of the LEADS Act, one of the components in that is strengthening the MLAT process. If the Justice Department wants access to that data, they should go through the MLAT process. The MLAT process could and should be better and faster and more streamlined, but that really has to be the direction we go. Otherwise, it just means that countries will just say, you can't put data with an American company anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino.
Thank you, Chairman. I know my colleague and co-author, Ms. DeBene, asked direct and pointed questions concerning the LEADS Act, so I don't want to get into rehashing that, but is there anyone on the panel that wants to respond even further because given the fact that Ms. DeBene ran out of time? Please.
Thank you for that. The LEADS Act is an important piece of legislation. If the court case that
I'm afraid you're going to have to use Mr. Black's microphone.
is that better? Yep.
Much.
So the LEADS Act is a very important piece of legislation, and if the court case that Microsoft is involved in goes the wrong way, there would indeed be disastrous consequences for U.S. companies. But I wonder if a small amendment to the LEADS Act to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently encourage data localization wouldn't be in order, to the extent that it says to companies, store the information in this country, and it's safe from the U.S., that I think would encourage people to store data in one location rather than the other. Instead, the real standard should be the nexus between the government and the data subject. If they're citizens or residents, then local law should apply. If they're not, then local law should not necessarily apply.
Okay, good. I'll ask that our staffs review your statement and others to see how we can make this more effective. Anyone else?
I would just say briefly that I think these are clearly new issues and they are complicated issues. I think the introduction of the LEADS Act and the work that's done, and I thank both you and Ms. DelBene for your work on that, demonstrates that while they are new issues and they are complicated issues, we as the United States can still show leadership on these issues and trying to move forward with various ways to approach them. And I think that's extremely important. I do think that we need to bring other governments into that. I think having international consensus around these issues is going to be very important. But the United States, I think, will inevitably need to show the way. And I thank members for the leadership that has already been shown on this issue.
Okay. If I could just jump in briefly, I think we all are in agreement on MLAT and LEADS. To understand the complexity and why we have to be careful, whether it's EU or us trying to come up with these solutions, the answer of is data owned or located? A conversation among the five of us, if we were sitting in different countries and there was a video capture of that, it would in fact be stored around the globe on different servers to be in the cloud. So who do each of us own it? What rights do the others have to stop it, block it, disseminate it? We get into some very complex issues. We believe we can find answers, but quick, easy, simple answers in this area is very difficult. Ownership of data is a very tricky concept, and trying to precisely identify it. The Microsoft case is very interesting because they've identified that the data has a location. A lot of people view the data they have on their servers disseminated through multiple servers, partly for security purposes. So the answers, the questions here are very tricky. The answers need collaborative between governments, multiple governments and private sector players to come up with solutions, which is why we're nervous about imposed solutions kind of rigidly applied in a regionally limited area.
Okay. I'm not sure if my colleague went into this area. If she did, perhaps you could expand on it. If not, take a shot at it. Give me your impression or what you've heard or what you see or think about this, the LEADS Act, potentially having an adverse effect on U.S. law enforcement compared to the abilities that they have now to obtain information from other countries. Dr. Atkinson.
Well, I think it's a question of do they look at their access in a short-term or long-term perspective. In the short run, at the margin, it makes it slightly harder for them to get access to that data. In the long run, it will make it impossible to get, or much more difficult to get access to that data. Because as I said before, the dynamic will be, if the rule is that the U.S. can compel a U.S. company to turn over data with a lower standard on a foreign person that's stored in their country, countries will just mandate that that data cannot be stored with a U.S. company, and that will make it harder, not easier, for law enforcement to get that data.
Okay. Mr. Spinell, you have 9 seconds.
Sorry?
You have 9 seconds.
I would just say the Department of Justice right now is in a situation where they don't know exactly what the rule is, and that lack of clarity and predictability is not helpful for law enforcement either. And so I think the LEADS Act would be helpful in making it clear and predictable for everyone involved, including law enforcement.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York is next, I think, or from Rhode Island. Which one of you is ready to go first? The gentleman will yield to the gentleman from New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for their presence here today and for very thought-provoking testimony. Let me start with Ms. Espinal. There have been some concerns that have been raised by some of the people that I represent and indeed many aspects of the American public about sort of the downside of the development of big data, the privacy concerns with respect to this data being misappropriated, abused, and misused. But I was wondering if you could speak to some of the potential upsides, the transformative nature of big data as it develops to improve, the quality of life or address social conditions or improve the functioning of the economy as we move forward.
I would be happy to. I will start by saying that our companies take the privacy issues very seriously, so those do need to be addressed. But I think we are living in exciting times. So here's a kind of incredible fact. If you look at all the data that exists in the world today, 98% of it was created in the last 2 years alone. That is extraordinary. That is obviously without precedent, and that is a rate of change that is going to continue to increase. That has enormous implications for businesses, but it also has enormous implications for human beings who can use that data. And already today, even though this is an early stage, I think, for data, we're seeing enormous societal impact. So we're seeing them, in cities that are using them to reduce pollution. Doctors are using data to make diagnosis more quickly. There's an example that relates to saving lives of premature babies that are in NICUs that is sort of personally very meaningful to me. There's research that's being done on Alzheimer's. Farmers are using them to increase their yields while reducing the use of pesticides. So I think the societal benefits from data used properly, are enormous. And beyond that, there are enormous economic benefits. So a conservative estimate of the gains from efficiency. So one of the things that businesses in the United States and Europe and around the world say is that using data helps them to be more efficient. And generally speaking, they report sort of a 5 to 6% increase in efficiency. If you take a very conservative estimate and assume that there will be a 1% gain in efficiency, we are talking about creating $15 trillion to the world economy by 2030. That is equivalent to another U.S. economy. So both from the economic point of view, from the ability of small businesses, as panelists have talked about before, to have access to international markets in a way that was never possible before, and in terms of some of the societal benefits we've seen, there's enormous promise. And I will just conclude by saying, while there is enormous promise, it is early days. And so one of the reasons that we are concerned about some of the trade barriers that we see around the world is because we fear that will cast a shadow on innovation to come.
Now, there are international concerns that many on the panel have spoken to in the context of trade and some of the court decisions that we've seen come out of Europe. I want to turn inward for a moment and ask you, Ms. Espinal, do you think that the United States, in the face of this exponential growth of data in such a short period of time, as it relates to that 98% figure, do we have an adequate legal and regulatory framework in place right now, or are there things that this committee, that this Congress should be thinking about in this new data era that we exist in?
I think it's inevitably the case that legal systems around the world are going to need to adjust to the world that we live in. There's countries' individuals' laws, and then there's sort of the global trading system that also needs to address. And we've talked about some of the pieces of legislation that we think could be helpful, like the Judicial Redress Act, in trying to repair, be part of the solution to getting us to a new safe harbor. We've talked about the LEADS Act. I think this is a rapidly evolving landscape. So I think it's entirely possible that we will need further legislative change in the United States, and I'm very confident that we will need legislative change in other countries of the world. And I will close by saying I think it is imperative that we have a global trading system that sets up strong and enforceable rules for data. Without that predictability around the world, I think it will be very difficult, not just for U.S. companies, but for all companies.
And in the limited time that I have, you mentioned the importance of American leadership, but you also said that it was important to develop international consensus. Could you speak to what some of the international challenges may be as it relates to how other international actors look at big data, which perhaps may differ than our view here in the United States?
So I could talk about this almost indefinitely. I will try to be very brief. So I'll just highlight a couple of things. One is, I think, other countries, sometimes the motivations are about trying to grow their domestic industry or trying to keep U.S. industry out of their markets. And so that is a reason or can be a motivation for why countries put in place restrictions to keep barriers out. But I think, as I alluded to before, I think part of the issue is that these are new cutting-edge issues. And so I think not just the United States, but countries around the world are struggling with how do you balance security and privacy appropriately. And so that is why I think while I believe the U.S. will and needs to show leadership on this, I also think it's incredibly important that it's not the U.S. going out and saying this is our solution and we think this should be imposed on the rest of the world. I think there does need to be an international consensus. I'm fully aware of the fact that not every country in the world is going to want to be or be able to be at that table right away. But I do think there are a number of countries where the United States could start having discussions about what norms in this area should look like, and that would be very productive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We now go to the gentleman from Texas who has been patiently at the end of the dais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I want to talk about a specific issue of privacy. Surveillance by government. That's what I'm talking about. Not cybersecurity or any of those other issues. Let's focus on that one issue. To me, the United States has always been the world leader in privacy. We have a Fourth Amendment that you're all familiar with. Many countries, maybe most, don't have such a concept as the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures by government. Mr. Atkinson, you talked about the Europeans use privacy as an excuse for really protectionism. I want to delve in this a little further and talk about and ask you your opinion of the three issues that we have regarding government surveillance on Americans. And if the perception of the Europeans is that America doesn't protect the right of privacy, perception, whether it's reality or not, is part of the reason we have this issue with the Europeans. And one of those is the concept of the FISA courts. The second is surveillance under 702 warrants. The third is backdoor searches and encryption that government may encourage our businesses to have into their systems. And the fourth is EPCA, whether it should be reformed or hasn't been reformed. Those four issues, to me, and I'm a former judge, are issues where it seems that government intrusion in those four areas and the failure for us, Congress, to redefine or define the Fourth Amendment to make sure it applies in those four areas or not, may be part of the problem we have with dealing with foreign countries on the issues that you've all talked about. So my question is, and I want all five of you to weigh in on this, just want your opinion. Does Congress, in your opinion, need to look at each of those four issues, those four areas where government surveillance on citizens is allowed, and fix that problem or look at those four issues? What do you think about that issue as regarding government surveillance on citizens and the effect it has on businesses being able to have the free flow of data to around the world. So that's really the only question I have, and I'd like to just start and go down the row and see what y'all think about that.
Start with me. So
Zaldinger.
I would agree with that. I'm less familiar, not an expert on the FISA court issue, but on all the other issues you brought up, I fully agree with you that we do need FISA reform on 702. ECFA, we've been a long supporter of it. It really is illogical that there is a lower standard of government access to data that's stored in the cloud than data that's stored on my home computer. It just doesn't reflect technological reality that we would treat those differently. So I fully agree with you on that, and I do think all of that, and including the backdoor issue and the intentional weakening of U.S. systems, that all of those things have hurt our ability to be a global technology leader, and they're going to continue to hurt us until we take steps on it. I will just say, though, and I think we need to be a little bit more vocal about saying that, is there are other countries that are doing things like that. If I were the Irish Data Protection Authority, I wouldn't let Irish data go to France. In other words, there are other countries that do these as well, and I think it's important that we make that we're not the only country that has challenges there.
I know other countries don't observe the concept of the Fourth Amendment, but we do in this country.
Exactly.
And I just want to know if that is a factor in this entire discussion. We got just about a minute left or less than that. Weigh in on that.
Briefly. Yes, I think those are all areas that Congress should consider. To speak to two of them, we are concerned about movements to undermine encryption, and we've made that clear. And we also very much support ECFA and would urge its quick passage by Congress. Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I'm going to yield back my 9 seconds.
And I'm going to take your 3 seconds back and treasure them always.
Love to chime in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think, and the gentleman's recognized for a short addition to the now expired time.
Very good points. Frankly, the world looks at what we do, not just what we say. If we're going to be a moral leader for an open, free internet, we need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And those are all areas where we need to do more. Without a doubt, I should point out there's a story that appeared today about the United Kingdom has just basically, apparently is either finally passed or very close to passing requirement that companies turn over or have encryption that can be broken. That would be a terrible precedent, and the UK does it. Rob made a point other countries are doing surveillance.
Ms. Expedel,
we should not be
familiar with
saying
that?
Others are, that we're the only ones that do some things. Governments want to have access to information that's global.
Yes, I should just say, and I will check on this, but we have been concerned about the UK's moves towards requiring backdoors to encryption and have raised that with the UK government. My understanding is that most recently the UK government has stepped back from that and has said that they are not going to be requiring backdoors to encryption in the legislation that is moving through the UK system. So I will check to confirm that and come back to you, but we view that as a very positive step because not to take too much time, but part of the reason that we are concerned about encryption here in the United States is not just because of here in the United States, but because of the precedent overseas. And so if my understanding is correct, and the UK government yesterday said they would move forward their legislation without those requirements to backdoors, we view that as at least one positive step in this discussion.
Mr. McCarthy, if the gentleman, okay, please.
Very briefly, I agree with...
Yeah. Again, you've got to use Mr. Black's microphone. We've denied you full access, I'm afraid.
Equal access to microphones. Mr. Paul, I agree that those are issues that need to be addressed. I agree that backdoors are a problem. We would oppose further movements in that area for the reasons that have been articulated. We're strong supporters of ECPA. But my point is that none of those things need to be preconditions for a successful resolution of the negotiation for a new workable safe harbor.
And with that, I'll take those 3 seconds and pass them on to the gentleman from Rhode Island for an additional 3 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for this very useful testimony as we sort of struggle with this question of how do we preserve cross-border data flows and for really making the point of how important this is to our economy and how unsustainable a system that interrupts those flows would be in the long term. And you've all spoken about the need for a narrowly crafted but least restrictive of trade kind of standard. And I want to sort of press you a little bit on that. And beginning with you, Mr. Ambassador, you make the same argument, of course, in your written testimony that we need a workable and commercially viable and legally valid alternative to the safe harbor provision. I wondered if you could just expand on this a little bit and describe what you think should be included in such an alternative, and also how do your member companies plan to take privacy concerns into account until such a new standard is developed?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, it is very important for all of our companies, because they're all dealing with cross-border data flows, that there be a successor to the now invalidated safe harbor. And I think it goes a lot back to what Rob Atkinson was saying, is that there's going to have to be a workable way of recognizing some of the differences in privacy laws, but also make it viable for companies to actually comply with it without making it completely chaotic. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have specific suggestions on how to rework that, but I think that, and as Victoria said, that once there is a successor, there needs to be sufficient time for companies to come into compliance. So I think there should be a recognition that, all right, if we've reached agreement, we leave the existing system in place for a reasonable period of time, and then these 4,000 companies, and some of them are small companies, a lot of them are, need time to then show that they can meet the new requirements of Safe Harbor 2.0 or whatever it's called.
Does anyone else have a suggestion? Yes, Dr. Atkinson.
I would agree with that, although I think ultimately we're going to have to move beyond the safe harbor to a formal trade agreement. I know people have alluded, for example, to the WTO protections or exemptions around in the services agreement around moving from privacy and security. Unfortunately, what we're seeing are countries that are using that as a guise for protectionism, China being a case in point. I have talked to Chinese government officials who tell me that they're justified in doing what they're doing because of national security concerns. It was just simply false. Under the way the WTO rules are set up, it's hard to bring that case. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to change the WTO rules anytime soon. That's why it's important to put this in trade and services agreement and a TTIP agreement with a very, very, very narrow exception so that countries can't use that to drive the truck of mercantilists through.
Yeah, may I just follow up, Dr. Atkinson? One thing that you said in your written testimony is that the European Court of Justice overturned the Safe Harbor Agreement not because of privacy concerns, but because of concerns about governmental access. Does it then sort of follow that either as part of the Safe Harbor, the new agreement, or in conjunction with it, that we put into place additional surveillance reforms to respond to that concern raised by the court? Sort of building on Judge Post's question.
I would argue that it does follow from that. I would say two quick things, though. One is they made that decision without any real judicial review. They must have just watched some videos from that was showing that, what NSA did or something. There was no real collection of evidence when they made that decision, and I think that should be very troubling. Secondly, as I said earlier, they haven't cut off other countries who have more problematic government access rules than we do. But having said that, I do think it's incumbent upon us to make some reforms that would go in that direction, as you said.
And just one final question for the panel. Does Congress have a role to play, and if so, what is it, in establishing this sort of modernized safe harbor framework? Is there a useful role that Congress can play in the development of that?
Sure. So I would say there's a short term and a long term. I think short term, we need to encourage the United States and Europe to come to agreement on a new safe harbor. We do not believe we need new U.S. legislation to do that, although we do hope the Judicial Redress Act passes as soon as possible. And I think Congress has a role to play in working with your European counterparts to encourage Europe to come to the table and to reach an agreement as quickly as possible on a Safe Harbor 2.0. But then looking at the long term, I think it is also clear that that is not our long-term solution. We're going to need a global solution. We're going to need something that is flexible and principles-based. And I think Congress absolutely should play a role in working with the administration and working with industries and working with your counterparts around the world and helping to determine what that long-term solution is going to look like.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. We now go to the gentlelady from San Jose.
Well, thank you. This has been very interesting, and I appreciate the insight shared by all the witnesses to the committee. You know, I think that we are in for a very tough time, actually, long term, in trying to reconcile very different approaches to freedom, essentially. If you take a look at what the European Court of Justice did, they basically said that the 2000 Commission had erred by failing to take into account the interaction of U.S. domestic law and U.S. international policy and the framework. In other words, it didn't take in the whole picture, and it's going to allow data protection agencies in each country to investigate violations. Well, where does that lead us? I mean, you've got a situation in Europe, and as Ms. Del Bene mentioned, many of us meet with the parliamentarians from Europe who feel that their decision on right to be forgotten is extremely important to them and very valuable. And when you get into it with them, you say, I mean, recently an agency in France ruled that links and content removed under their right to be forgotten has to be removed worldwide. And when you talk to them about, hey, we have a First Amendment, even if we agreed with you, we can't agree with you. I mean, we can't allow elimination of First Amendment rights. So when you talk about data, I think it depends on what kind of data you're talking about. I mean, if you have a database that it's a product of a health study and it's completely owned by, you know, a university, it's possible to control the sharing of that data in a very different way than a posting on Facebook. You know, I think we're looking down the road at some very severe, and I'm not sure how we get to a situation that's going to be suitable. But getting to that, I'm wondering, you know, Mr. Black, you mentioned that the right to be forgotten, and others have talked about it, is a major barrier to data flow. How do you see this ending up when you've got the First Amendment that protects Americans' right to free speech and a Europe that has no equivalent respect for speech but has an equivalent right to censor? How are we going to resolve this?
Well, as I try to indicate, it's a very troubling concept, and when you think about it, if it becomes somehow an established precedent, and we are seeing other countries in other part of the world are considering similar versions, it is an amazing shield for basically hiding data, distorting history, the ability to prevent, frankly, honest information transfer. We talk about data, and we all use data, and it's important we do, but we're talking about information and knowledge, and the ability to block information and knowledge, to block people's ability to communicate, and part of communication is getting information, is a very serious precedent. And unless it is whittled down and we find some way to back off of the broad reach, I mentioned the extraterritorial aspect, that's exceptionally troubling, but frankly, even if you don't go to that step, the breadth of the concept of the right to be forgotten, the ability, and we all want database to be cleaned up of erroneous fact, but again, it is once again imposing a liability on players, intermediaries, that is fundamentally a flaw, and you can do it for so many purposes. You can, and right. We had this discussion earlier, but if you have intermediaries liable for what users do, for information or data that flows over their networks, you will have a crippling of the open internet as we know it today.
Well, what I see, I mean, I'm sorry, Mr. Marino had to leave, but we have safe harbors in the DMCA, and we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And we have some provisions that allow the internet to flourish. They don't have that in Europe. And so I think that's part of the reason why they don't have an internet economy. They have crippled their tech sector in that way, and maybe a few others. And to think that you can control the flow of data and have an internet, That's not how the internet works. So I think that we have a fundamental misunderstanding with some of our colleagues in parliaments across the world. That's not to say there aren't countries that are just using this as an excuse. I mean, you take a look at the countries that want to have localized data, Russia, China, Turkey. These are not countries that are, wallowing in free speech. They have a different agenda. I just want to make one final comment on or maybe even a question on copyright, because we've also got a problem there, and it's a crossover with free speech. We recently had a situation where European book publishers are saying that you can't actually index their books, and that if you index their books, there'd be an index tax, which is, I remember when people wanted to do an email tax. That's not going to happen. And so I've been telling the parliamentarians that if they look ahead in Europe, they're going to be like China, because we're going to have to cut them off, because we're not going to lose our freedom because they don't value theirs. Do you see it going in that direction?
This is an excellent area for action to actually be taken by the U.S. government. Under the Berne Convention, okay, it's very clear there is a right in order to basically have access to news. We think if the U.S. government wishes to, some of the snippet tax approaches are in fact challengeable under existing law. We've all said we want to improve the rules governing data flow around the world, but there are some rules that are in effect now that are not being utilized. And in this area, we think there's room for action immediately to go after some of these more egregious attempts to, frankly, alter the rules of access to information.
Mr. Chairman, can I just have 1 second more to make a comment? When Spain said you can't link to news articles, and Google just withdrew, and then none of the newspapers could find readers. So I think to some extent there's a role for the government to play, but I think also companies are going to have to take action themselves because they can't live with some of these rules. And I think when the European public can't actually access information, there's going to be reaction among the public themselves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I thank you for that salient point. I think it is one of those where be careful what you wish for. May Spain always have the dark ages back if that's what it wishes for. Dr. Atkinson, I'm going to ask you sort of a question that I know the answer to, but it may be a will question as much as it can. Would it be helpful and or appropriate and or possible to sue the EU under the WTO in light of their decision?
So I'm not a trade lawyer, and I know when Ira Magaziner made those veiled threats back in the late 90s to get the Europeans to come to the table on safe harbor, he did suggest that we file a suit with the WTO. I think the case is stronger now, as I said earlier, because they haven't just said they've only cut us off. They haven't cut off other countries who have even less governmental protection. So I think there is a possibility, and I think we shouldn't back down from holding out as Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly but carry the big WTO stick.
Yeah, I'm sure that WTO was in that. Let me ask a broader question. I had the opportunity to be in Antarctica last year. 53 nations, I had to look that up to remember, 53 nations are all part of an international treaty that says you can go there, you can have things there, you can't mine and take the resources, and nothing can be done there that essentially isn't agreed to by the party of the wholes. It's a non-country by international agreement. As this committee goes forward with a number of pieces of legislation, and we're looking at privacy domestically, and then we're looking at a global world, I'd like each of your comments briefly. Just as we have around our customs systems, if you will, sort of free trade zones, we have places where you can bring your goods to the United States, but they're not in the United States for any practical purposes. There's no tariff, and quite frankly, they're still considered to be not in the country. So they can only be seized or looked at as a ship might be boarded in international waters. Should we use, if you will, a combination of these two models, the free trade zone in the U.S. and the idea that just like Antarctica, there have to be places, in this case the cloud, in which all countries have to view it as outside their reach, and as such, not so easily taken, whether it's in the U.S. and Europeans are concerned that their privacy will be breached, or vice versa, inside another country where somehow the standard would be artificially higher or lower to enforce whatever is subject to what I would envision as an international trade agreement that mirrors, if you will, the best of the protections of, let's say, the Europeans, and ourselves and other partners. Could I have your comments on that?
Sure. One of the reasons we're having this debate right now over privacy, it's emblematic of a broader set of questions a number of the panelists members have brought up. And really what we lack is we lack a consistent, readily understandable and shared global framework for thinking about governing the internet. And by that I don't mean ICANN governance, I mean all of the policy questions that countries face with regard to the internet. We don't have a shared view of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and I think we've proposed that in a recent report called the Framework for Resolving Cross-Border Internet Policy Conflicts, and I think it's incumbent upon
and I appreciate that, and I'd love you to answer further, and I'll read any material you send me. My question was more narrow, is should we take away in some hosting environments, if you will, a cloud and say it does not reside inside the U.S. even though it's in Toledo, but in fact it doesn't reside in any nation, and all nations have to observe at the same level of respect, as though one might do an extradition rather than a simple subpoena, no greater, no less than that. And that's one of my questions is, if we're going to make the cloud a free trade zone, do we have to begin looking at it as not ours, even if it's in the U.S., and not theirs, even if it's hosted there? And I'll just go down the list, but please stay narrowly focused, because I want to get to Mr. Johnson.
I guess just quickly, I'm not sure that is exactly the right way to go, because there are legitimate things the government have access to and concerned that are legal, and if it's in the cloud, it shouldn't be extraterritorial, in my view. It should be covered by a trade agreement.
Just so you know, the chairman of the full committee made it very clear in the last round of legislation that this committee was tired of our country knowing more about us and us knowing less about them. So you may find that the definition of legitimate interest of the government is on the wane from this committee rather than the ebb it had after 9/11. Ambassador?
I thought your metaphor was very interesting, because the free trade zone, as you say, the products are in there and you can do all sorts of things with them, but once they leave that zone, they're subject to whatever the duties are and the regulations are of the market they're going into. So I don't know whether it's perfect, but in a sense, the cloud is where it resides, and then only when it leaves the cloud for a particular reason does it become subject to, well, whatever the jurisdiction is of where it is being used. It's an interesting thought.
So I would just say I will take that to be a serious proposal, and I would like to give it serious consideration. But I could just make two observations. Free trade zones work in part because they sit inside of a global trading system that has rules, and so I think part of this would have a prerequisite to this would be to have that global trading system of rules for data.
By the way, I think it was about 1959 that we started trying to get Antarctica. We're only at 53 countries, so I have no illusions that this would necessarily be quick and easy. But it begins to appear to me that if we do not begin to think of the cloud as not America's, then the rest of the world will say, if it's going to be yours when it's in America, then it's going to be mine if I have the ability to mandate it. And that's exactly what this hearing today was about, is how do we get that free flow to be not a bias toward a country of residence to the detriment of others' concerns. Mr. Black.
I think it's an intriguing idea. I agree it should get some serious consideration, look at the ramifications. I hate to use metaphors I haven't thought out ahead of time, but, you know, when we talk about the oceans, we have territorial waters, and then we have the open sea. May well be there's a certain appropriateness here to think of things that should not be geographically and therefore governmentally tied to one nation. I'd like to explore that.
Mr. McCarthy, as you answer it, I want to tell you, I did, grab the right one. I did not use the high seas because there's too much seizing of things on the high seas, but rather places in which the world has agreed to a common set of protection, a common set of respect for other countries. Nobody can go into Antarctica and do something where other countries are not essentially consulted in the process. So it is a little more like extradition and a little less like the high seas. Mr. McCarthy.
So I think the idea is worth exploring in great detail. I worry that even our own regulators, who have a responsibility to protect the privacy and the anti-fraud interests of our own consumers, would want to gain access to information in order to enforce local law. And so the idea that there could be a place of the cloud, the internet, that is literally a place without law, that probably is the right way to go. The next step of trying to harmonize the rules probably is difficult. We've heard the difficulties in the First Amendment. Privacy is also a very, very difficult issue to get harmonized laws. We've got a sectoral approach. The Europeans have a different approach. But you can make those rules interoperate. That's what the safe harbor was supposed to be all about, and that's why we have to get it back into place as soon as possible.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Johnson, but I'll leave you with this because we can certainly, many of you, we regularly have a dialogue with. If the United States is to lead, we certainly have exclusively within our jurisdiction the ability to create these zones. We have the ability to lessen our own authority over a site hosted under this concept that it is not America without specific protections. In other words, a foreign hosting site, to use a term that may not exist yet. But, you know, the United States could tomorrow decide that we're going to have foreign hosting sites, and that a foreign hosting site is by definition one in which the Department of Justice and others must treat it as a non-U.S. and use an open and transparent process in order to go after it, and not treat it quite the same as we would a U.S. In other words, give it all the protections of being in the U.S. from a standpoint of the NSA not being able to hack it, and yet give it additional protections. This is not a new concept to think about, can we do better? The question is, will America lead? And that's what I'd like to have in the days and months to come. Your comments on, can America lead by creating something which the rest of the world could have a higher belief on? And if we do this the same as we created the Internet, and we set the standards, and then we gave it as a gift to the world, at least as to entities which are hosted within our borders, but hosted under some enhanced protection and assurances for the rest of the world, we could lead a standard that I doubt that Russia and China would follow, but I certainly would like to reach a standard that the EU would admire and emulate. Mr. Johnson, I apologize for going a little long, but gentleman's recognized.
Well, no, in fact, I'm prompted to yield whatever time that the gentleman would extend to me, the 5 minutes. I tend to think I might be better off by just simply yielding to you and listening to your questions. There's a lot that I missed having been absent at a Armed Services Committee meeting, and I don't want to go over plowed ground. I'm just kind of here to learn. And so with that, I will yield back to the chair.
I thank the gentleman. Briefly in the record, and then you can extend, and I'll say that in my closing remarks.
We have every reason to expect that we'll see a rapid conclusion of that. Commissioner Jarova is coming over here in a couple of weeks. Maybe there'll be something there. They have every incentive to get this right. Digital trade between the United States and Europe is huge. We have a global trade surplus of $150 billion in digital trade. They have a global surplus of 163. They know that their fundamental interests are at stake here, and I think they're going to act to try to put in place a safe harbor to make transatlantic data flows work again.
Mr. Black.
Reclaiming your moment. Very short. There's a lot of consensus I think you heard today. The reality is that we're going to have a lot of these problems linger for a while. They're not easy solutions. The Internet is a tremendous part of our future. I guess I would urge, as a U.S. citizen, that we had a huge role in creating the Internet. We have a tremendous history and an essential one to the First Amendment and freedom of speech. As we go forth and set rules domestically or internationally, that we keep at the forefront of our principles that commitment to openness, to freedom, to access to information, and that has, frankly, created the climate that has allowed the Internet to flourish. If we do that, we're going to still have a lot of problems to wade through, but keeping our eyes on that fundamental set of principles will lead the way. Thank you.
Ms. Espinel.
Thank you. Well, I would start off by thanking you for holding this hearing and focusing attention on this issue. Having given me extra time, I'll just reiterate two things I said before.
You could just tell us, what was it like being at E&C versus here? Which committee did you think better of? You can be impartial
Clearly
here.
This one.
Of course.
I think in terms of the trade barriers that we've talked about, we have been playing policy whack-a-mole for over 5 years. There are countries around the world that have been considering trade barriers or putting trade barriers forward, and our hope and expectation is that TPP will be at least the start of a mechanism to push back on those. And so if it does what we believe that it does, it is a truly historic opportunity. The second thing is just, if I could go back to the US-EU safe harbor, because it is sort of an issue of immediate concern. I agree with Mr. McCarthy. All indications are that the United States and Europe will be able to come to a quick conclusion on a Safe Harbor 2.0, but anything that Congress can do to encourage U.S. and Europe to come together on that would be great. But we need to bear in mind that if the Safe Harbor is concluded and if there is an appropriate period of time for U.S. companies to come into compliance, that will only get us so far, and then we are going to immediately need to turn to working out what our long-term solution will be, because I do not believe that this next safe harbor will be that long-term solution.
Anyone else? Doctor?
So I think one of the things that's been happening in the last few years is that the policy realities have finally caught up to the nature of the global Internet, and not in a good way. And I think the challenge that we face both here and around the globe is we have to figure out a way to balance the differences that we have between countries, legitimate differences in values and cultures. We're not all going to agree. We can never do that. And so we have to figure out a way that allow the Internet to thrive and flourish in a system where people are going to have different rules and different policies. At the same time, we have to be able to have a way that global free trade in data goes on, and goes on in a robust way. And I think we can square that circle, but it's really going to require not just all these specific actions we've talked about, which are important. It's going to require a larger conversation along the lines of what you proposed, a much bigger way to think about this, and a way to bring in countries like the Antarctic problem that we've tried to solve. We need something like that at the global level now.
Ambassador, you get the close.
Thank you very much. Well, these issues that we've been talking about, cross-border data flows, localization, open Internet, and so forth, they should be subject to rules that are multilateral, and the place normally to do that would be the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is not operating at this point in a way that we can do that. And so our second best alternative is to get these issues right in each of the negotiations that we're undertaking, whether it's the TPP, the one with Europe, the one on services, bilateral investment treaties with China, and at least try to get a cohesive and right approach in all of those to create de facto the template. The advantage of the WTO, if we can get it there, is that there is dispute settlement. It's legally binding, and so, for example, if there is a dispute about whether somebody is using a health reason or a prudential reason for protectionism, you can at least battle it out within a legal framework there. So I think that's what we should ultimately be looking for, but in the meantime, we need to get it right in the other negotiations.
Well, I want to thank all of you for a delightful conversation back and forth. I think to all of us who attended, this was very useful. As promised, I will leave 5 legislative days to submit additional written materials on any subject, but particularly the ones that I brought up. And if you have any additional extraneous material, we also would accept that. And with that, we stand adjourned.